Hi, I'm Neil Creek, and this is Night Photography Unlocked. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about a very useful photographic tool called the histogram. And the histogram is a readout that gives you information about exposure that is available both in your camera and in post-processing software. Now, all digital SLRs have the histogram tool built in, as do many bridge cameras and many compact cameras. Now, to show you how the histogram works, I'm going to do this lecture in two parts. I'm going to do some shooting out here at night, and I'm going to take you into the processing afterwards and show you how you can use the histogram in both stages. Now, it's a little bit tricky to show you the histogram on screen, so we've got this bridge camera set up pointing at the screen of the digital SLR, which we're going to use to show you what is showing on the camera as I take photos. Now, just before I get into the practical demonstration, I'll just explain a little bit about the histogram and why it's such a useful tool. When you're taking photos, it's very hard to subjectively assess the exposure of a photo just by looking at the screen. There's a number of reasons. You could have glare on the screen's brightness could be turned down. For any reason, you can't be completely confident that what you see on the screen is how the photo actually is. What the histogram is it's a measurement of the brightness of the pixels in the photo displayed as a graph. So if you've got your histogram, it's like a graph, and at one end, you've got the pixels that are at their darkest. At the other end, the top end, you've got the pixels at their brightest. And along the graph is increasing brightness values for those pixels. The vertical axis of the graph is the number of pixels of each particular brightness. So if you have a big bulge in the graph at the left end, then that's a lot of dark pixels. If you've got a big bulge in the graph at the right end, that's a lot of bright pixels. And you can tell a lot about the photo by seeing the distribution of the pixels that are in the histogram. So rather than talking about it, let's just get into it and show you how it works, and that will help you better understand how to use the histogram. So we've got the camera pointed here, setting up, pointing at the trees with some of the sky in the background. Now it's after sunset and the light is quickly fading, but we're going to just get some shots and show you how changing the exposure settings can affect the histogram and the exposure of the photo. Now, the trees in front are very dark, and the sky, although it's not as bright as the daytime sky, it's much, much brighter. So we've got a high contrast situation here. So we're going to start with the camera, the 5D Mark II. We've got it set to 1 second, f3.5 and ISO 400. So let's get a quick shot and see how that looks. Okay, now you can see we've got the exposure is quite bright. That's partly because what's coming through on the compact camera recording it. But you've got very overexposed areas in the sky, and the foreground's not too bad. But if we go to our histogram, which we do by pressing the info button a couple of times, we can see that we've got a big, big peak far to the left there, which is in the dark pixels, which trails off about a quarter of the way into the histogram, and then there's not much in the way of pixels all the way to the far right. However, at the far right here, you can see that there's actually no big spike at the end. That means there's no pixels that are overexposed. Now let's increase the exposure significantly, and we'll get another shot and see what happens when we overexpose. So we'll go from 1 second up to, say, 10 seconds. Okay, let's have a look at that. Now, as we can see here, the photo in the preview is much more overexposed, and the pixels have been pushed over to the right, and you can see we've got a big bulge here in the sort of the 1/3 mark. They're all the darker pixels that were pushed up to the left, but they've been pushed further to the right now, and so they're more in the mid-tones. But we've lost all the detail in the sky, and they've just become just plain white. As you can see from the big spike at the right here, that means that there are a lot of pixels in the whites. And when you get a big spike like that, that means that you haven't got detail in the far end, the far reaches of the exposure, and they've clipped. So you can't bring any detail out of that photo when processing. Now, as I've shown you, we've got a high contrast scene. If we just go back to the previous photo, you can see it's high contrast. There's bright sky and dark foreground. That's evidenced by the fact that when we expose for the foreground, the sky is blown out. So let's take our settings back down to where we were. We'll go down to 1 second. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add in some light from a light stand here, which will bring up the exposure of the foreground and hopefully make it closer to the exposure of the sky, so it won't be quite as high contrast. Now you'll see how that affects the histogram. Okay, so now that we've got that light, we're going to take another shot. Now, as you can see, we've got still a big spike to the left, and that's going to be something we can't help because there's always going to be mostly dark pixels with these settings. But instead of being all pushed right up to the left, you notice now that they're spread out more to the right. And that's as a result of the midground pixels being increased in their brightness by adding that light. So the way we're reading the histogram here is it's telling us that there's more pixels with brighter values and fewer pixels with the brightest values, but most of the pixels have the darkest values. Now we can go to the extreme, and let's make this a 30-second exposure, and we'll double the ISO as well, and you'll see how much it's pushed the histogram across to the right. Okay, now as you can see there, this photo is grossly overexposed. You can't even see it in the recording from the compact camera, but we'll overlay the picture so you can see how it looks from the camera. And looking at the histogram, we've got next to no pixels at half brightness or below. There's no blacks, there's no darks, and very few midtones. It's only in the highlights and the whites that we're really seeing a lot of pixels. And that photo is completely overexposed, it's completely blown. So reading the histogram on the camera will give you a good idea of how well exposed you are. If you've got a peak at either end, then you might want to look at changing your exposure to try and get more of those pixels moved out of that end. It doesn't matter if there's a peak at one end or the other if the pixels throughout the rest of the photo are evenly distributed. You'll get a shot like that if you're pointing, say, into a bright street light. However, it's best if you do try and get most of the pixels in the middle, or not at either end, because that gives you the most range to process your photos and get the best possible results afterwards when you edit them. And that's what we're going to do now. We'll take these photos and we'll bring them into post-processing software, and I'll show you how the histogram works in the software to help you process the photos. Alright, we've got the photos that we just took in the demonstration video imported here into Lightroom, which is my preferred editing software. Now we're going to cover post-processing your photos in another lecture later on, but just for the sake of demonstration of the histogram, we're going to just briefly look at post-processing and using the histogram as a tool to assist with that. So the first photo we took in the demonstration, we've got here selected, and if you look over on the right here, you can see the histogram for that photo. It also shows the settings that the photo had underneath. Now, one quick point to make about the Lightroom histogram is that it also shows color information as well as just black and white like we have on the back of the camera. Now, this can be very useful, but it's not something you need to worry about right now. All you need to know is that the histogram is separated out into the different color channels, and they're displayed overlaid upon each other. So you can see if there's any bright pixels of a particular color, and that can help you with your processing. For example, we've got a blue spike here on the far right, and the whites and the highlights, and that's reflected in the image here in the sky, where the sky color is more blue than anything else. So we can see that the histogram generated by Lightroom is very similar to the histogram that was on the back of the camera. An important point to make is that the histogram is generated not from the raw data, but from a JPEG preview created by either the camera or by your processing software. Raw data in itself is just numbers. It's not displayable as an image, so it has to be generated into a preview image. The camera generates a JPEG inside its own software, and your processing software does the same thing, generating a JPEG preview of your current state of the raw file. And it's from that JPEG preview that the histogram is created. What that means is that the histogram might be slightly different when viewing it on your camera versus viewing it on your processing software. And it means that it's not displaying the full potential dynamic range of your photo in the histogram. Now we'll come back to that in a moment and explain why that's important, but just for now, looking at the histogram, you can see that if there's a difference between the histogram from your processing software and from your camera, it's not important right now. So let's take a look at the second photo we took, where we increased the exposure significantly. Now that's similar to how it looked on the back of the camera, with the values pushed across to the right. And the pixels on the right and the highlights, that peak is a little bit higher than it appeared to be in the camera, but it's very similar in shape and structure. On to the third picture where we added our light, and you can see again it's the peak on the left which has been pushed out to the right. And the dramatically overexposed image, again, you can see the same shape as we had on the back of the camera. So how do we use the histogram as a tool for processing? Well, let's load into the develop module where we edit our photo, and we've got our exposure controls here. Now, as I hover over the exposure controls, you can see that the histogram has been highlighted in the center and the word exposure appears underneath. Now, the exposure slider changes essentially the exposure across the whole image, but it's referring there in the histogram to the midtone section. Highlights is the highlights area, shadows is the shadows, whites and blacks. You can see the labels appear underneath, and the same thing happens when I hover over the histogram itself. So that's some useful feedback. As we can see here, the vast majority of our pixels in this photo are in our blacks and our shadows. So if we increase the exposure slider, we will see the effect on the histogram with the pixels being pushed across to the right into more the shadows and midtones area. It also increases the number of pixels in the whites, and that's the sky. So what we've got now is we've got a better exposed photo in processing, which is what we did with our second photo by increasing the exposure. Now, another important point to note is that this is only possible with RAW. When taking a photograph in JPEG, the pixel values in the JPEG are limited to what you actually see. If you want to increase or decrease the exposure on a JPEG, then you'll push the exposure slider right or left, but the gaps from the pixels that have been emptied by moving them across have to be filled with imaginary pixels, pixels that are estimated color values. And that can lead to some artifacts and some issues with processing that you don't get with RAW. If you're doing the same thing with RAW, however, it has more data than can be displayed in the preview, and that data is kept available to be used if you change the exposure settings. So while we're sliding our exposure slider here, we're actually updating the preview image from that raw data. So if I push all the way across the right here, you can see that we've lost the detail in the sky there, and we've got more detail in the shadows. However, if you're shooting in JPEG, that would just be a black mush because the detail isn't there in the original photo. So this is an excellent reason for shooting RAW, especially at night, because you're going to have these high contrast situations. So what does this tell you about how to capture and process your photos while looking at the histogram? Well, if you compare this photo with the next photo, we can actually go back and increase the exposure on the first photo to somewhat match that of the second. But by doing so, we've pushed things along here and we've stretched the exposure in this area. Now, yes, there is more information in there in RAW than there is in JPEG, but the least you need to stretch the exposure, the better for the photo. So if you take a photo like this, but you prefer to have it dark, then decreasing the exposure will have a better effect than taking it that exposure and trying to increase the other way. So it's probably best when taking your photos to try and get a relatively even distribution of light throughout the histogram and then tweak it in processing afterwards. You'll usually get better results that way. Now, it's not necessary to shoot that way. It does help. But using the histogram, you can see if you've got a good distribution of pixels or if you've got a problem where things are pushed too far to the right, as is the case here with the big spike, or too far to the left where you've got a big spike there. Either way, looking at those histograms, you will see that you are over or underexposed, and you may have room in the upper end where you can increase the exposure to spread those pixels across for more information. So watching the histogram when capturing photos will give you a clue as to any issues you might be facing and possibly tell you that you should take your photo again with different settings. And when you're editing your photo, you can see if there's an issue by looking at the histogram, and you can then watch the histogram as you change your settings in order to address that issue. So the histogram is a very handy feedback tool for both shooting and processing your photos. Now, I'll be talking more about processing in later lectures after we come to the case studies, but next up we're going to be talking about another crucial element to night photography, and that is getting accurate focus. So we'll talk about that in the next lecture.